Today's topic, resistance, is especially relevant to my home country, Luxembourg. Luxembourg, not Luxembourg, Germany. It's a known country. It's as small as the state of Rhode Island, but it is surrounded by Germany, Belgium, and France. It was occupied for 4 long years by the Nazi rulers. And unlike France, Belgium, and other Western nations that had been occupied, we were made part of the Third Reich. In other words, we had forced German citizenship. Young men and young women were conscripted by force into the Nazi army for 4 years. Those who did not go, you can only imagine what happened. The reprisals were terrible for this small country that had been a neutral country prior to May 1940. There were a lot of summary trials, torture, execution, deportations of entire families into Eastern Prussia, what is now parts of Poland, and in my family, I had 2 family members that got deported there. Then, of course, we had the forced enrollment in the German labor service, forced conscription of the male youth in the armed services. But, of course, there was a great deal of resistance, as in every occupied country, both in Europe, in Scandinavia, and in the Pacific. The topic this afternoon, before moving on to the participants of this panel, let me just briefly elaborate a little bit on the topic. By definition, a resistance movement is a group or collection of individuals dedicated to fighting an invader in an occupied country, primarily through the use of physical force, as was the case in many countries during World War II. Members of such groups, whatever their organizational structure and political objectives may be, are usually called freedom fighters or partisans. To the enemy especially, they are partisans, maquisards, guerrilla troops, or terrorists. A name that primarily appeared after World War II, but resistance movements can include any irregular armed forces that rises up against an enforced authority or occupant. Some resistance movements are underground organizations engaged in the struggle for national liberation in a country under military occupation. Resistance during World War II was dedicated to fighting the Axis invaders. It was a war without mercy on both sides. Pardon was seldom given to captured resistance fighters. It should be highlighted that numerous fighting resistance movements also had numerous female fighters who, along with their male counterparts, fought courageously with armed hands. Again, every occupied country had resistance movements and partisan groups, some of them linked by extensive networks. After the Allied landings in Normandy, all of those occupied Western nations' resistance units became very valuable in supporting the Allied advances, just as their Eastern European counterparts, like the Soviet partisans, Polish resistance movements, Czech underground, Slovak and Yugoslav partisan groups, just to name a few. But one should not also forget, however, that inside Germany, there were some very small German resistance group, more of the non-combatant type, such as the White Rose or the Red Orchestra, opposing the Hitler regime. Even high-ranking staff officers determined to do away with Hitler, as we all know from July 20, 1944, the bomb attempt that unfortunately failed, and if successful, could have changed the outcome of the war. To discuss this important chapter of overall World War II history, we have with us today 3 distinguished panelists, and I'm honored to introduce first Mr. Jaroslav or Jarek Piekalkiewicz, former Polish resistance member and participant as a fighter in the August 1st to October 3rd Warsaw Uprising. Thank you very much, and please welcome Mr. Piekalkiewicz.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'm very honored to be here and also humbled because in the whole program of this conference, I'm the only one to speak for European resistance. And by that why I'm humbled, because I'm speaking for thousands and thousands of fighters, women, half of them at least were women, and half were men, who died for the cause and who contributed substantially to the Allied victory. But my subject, of course, and when I talk about my own experience, I want you to think about all those other people in Europe who did the same or very similar things. Now, the knowledge of the Polish resistance in the West is very limited, because after the war, Poland was occupied and turned into Soviet satellite. And we who were in the Polish resistance were as much fighting the Germans as we were against the Soviets. We were fighting for the freedom of Poland. And as a result, any information about us was suppressed by the government. Indeed, many people I knew were imprisoned, and that's the reason I couldn't go back to Poland. Now, the Polish, let me talk a little bit about how contribution of Polish resistance to the war effort was in general. By 1944, the Polish resistance fighters were 380,000 in numbers, so that's a substantial amount of people involved. As a matter of fact, after Yugoslavia, this is the largest number in Europe. But how to measure our impact? I think the best thing is to measure how many German troops were needed to occupy us. And in 1939, there were 125,000. By 1944, there were 475,000, nearly 500,000. Now, those people would have been used on Eastern Front or Western Front, but they had to stay in Poland to fight us. But this is, of course, excuse me, our greatest effort was the Warsaw Uprising, when we fought the Germans for 63 days, from August 1st to October 3rd. And they suffered considerable losses. They lost 17,000 killed and missing, and they had 9,000 very heavily wounded soldiers. Now, we lost 18,000, so comparable amount of people, and we have about 25,000 wounded. But in addition, and that's the tragic, 150,000 to 200,000 Polish civilians were killed, and the city was completely destroyed. But Professor, stop now. This is a memory hall. Stop lecturing and talk about yourself. When I was in 1941, I was living in a small town, Biała Podlaska, east of Warsaw. And my cousin and I decided that there is not enough resistance to the Germans, so we started our own. We were 15 years old at the time, and we started to organize, train, gather weapons. And in a year, when we joined the major resistance, we had 100 people in our group, and the oldest one was 31 years old. And he didn't know that the leader, the commanding officer, was only 15. That was me. But in Biała, I escaped from the roundup, German roundup, for slave labor. So I had to make my way to Warsaw, where I lived before the war and where my mother lived. And in Warsaw, I joined another resistance group, the same organization, which was called AK, Armia Krajowa, a home army. And I also, through the contacts of my mother, joined the auxiliary of the Warsaw Fire Brigade. Now, that was very important because I got the uniform, and the Germans always respected uniforms. So if you had a uniform, they thought that you were on their side. And the uniform helped me tremendously and got me a lot of time out of trouble. Well, let me tell you the worst one. I was coming one day, and it was winter, January 1944, and I had my gun stuck here, and leather coat and my uniform, and I was turning the corner, of a street. There was heavy snow, so I couldn't see very well. And suddenly I felt the barrel of the gun just a little bit above my gun. And then they shine the light in my face, and in very polite German, they say, "Excuse me, sir," and let me go. Now, I tried to go as well as I nonchalantly, but about half a block, my legs turned to mush. Now, the second close call was nothing to do with the uniform this time, but I was very lucky. In June of 1944, I deserted from the fire brigade, and I devoted myself completely to underground work because we knew that the uprising is coming. The Russian army was only a few miles really from Warsaw. But we needed weapons. So I trained a little group of a little unit of 5 people to go and disarm the Germans. Now, I went when it was very hard because they already were afraid, and there were 3 or 4 of them usually in one together. So we had to look for a guy who would be alone. And we found one in the red light district. He was a Cossack in the German service, and he was slightly drunk. So I stopped, I pulled my gun out, and I told him to put his hands up. I was very polite, but he was not a gentleman. He went for his gun. So I fired from the hip because reading a lot of Western stories, I knew that you fire from the hip, and I missed. And after I missed, I only had 8 bullets left, and the police, the German police was not very far, the police station, so I decided to run. And that was the right decision. In the Warsaw Uprising, I was a sergeant, and I was in charge of a section of 5 people. We were very badly armed, but still we fought for 62 days. And I don't really have time to go into the details, but the only thing which we had was hand grenades. And since I was a poor shot, I really loved the hand grenades because you throw them and there is a big explosion. And then if you hit somebody, fine. If not, that's too bad. When we capitulated in Warsaw, even the Germans recognized our bravery. And also they wanted, because the Russians were just across the river from us. But they knew that we would fight them, that we wanted free Poland, and they wanted the Germans to kill us, to destroy us. So we had no help from them whatsoever. When we capitulated, the Germans recognized and gave us combatant rights, and we became POWs. But as most of my colleagues did, I could not stay still and wait. Like a good boy, I could have waited until the end of the war. But I escaped. First time from the train, second time from the death march, and they caught me again. And the third that march reached Rhine River, and third time was successful. I mean, third time, it must be successful. And then I have a little bit, do I have a little more time? Yep. How many minutes?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, let me tell you just very quickly about the escape from the train. We're traveling at night, and I went to the door was, the window was with barbed wires. It was not difficult to cut, but you had to have something to cut with. And we were searched many times before. And I was standing just figuring out how to get out. And this little fellow, I'm little, but he was really small, came to me, and with this beautiful Warsaw accent, he said to me, "Are we taking off?" And I said, "That's a general idea, but how to cut it?" He said, "No problem." And he had all the files on him. As we were cutting the barbed wire, and he told me that he was a professional criminal from before the war. Now then he told me how to get out, how to squeeze and stand on the bumper. He did that before many times. But the Germans, I must say, were very polite to me because they stopped the train at the red light. So I didn't have to jump out, being shot at, all this, all this film-like stuff. I just climbed under the car and waited for the train to go. And that was it. But after 5 days, they caught me. And when they caught me, they put me in a camp, which was Sagan, which was for the camp for people who were not very likely to stay put, like myself. And on the basis of, from that camp was The Great Escape, and the movie was made. This was the camp I was in. But the movie, as the program says, was made on the basis of my escape. This is a lie. It was just made on the basis of escapes of American and British airmen. Okay, let me now finish by saluting you. I have a beret, which is a fake, but I had that something like that in the uprising. So let me salute you in the Polish way. Thank you very much.
Great story, isn't it? I just have one quick question to Jarek. It is known that during the Warsaw Uprisal, the Soviet army was only 12 miles away, and they could have come to help you and rescue you. They did not. Was that because of the Polish secret army, the Home Army, was loyal to the government, which was in exile in London?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, and they were no closer than that because Warsaw is divided by a river Vistula, and they were on the other side. We could see them.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, thank you very much for clarifying that. So let's move on. Our next participant, Jack Sullivan, is a native boy here of New Orleans, and he answered the call of duty, and he became a member of the 100th Division. And this division is famous for participating in the landings in southern France from the Mediterranean during the Operation Dragoon, sometimes also known as Operation Anvil. This is in many World War II history books, unfortunately, a lesser visible campaign than the Normandy landings and ensuing Allied operations, but so much necessary to push the enemy out of those parts of France to ensure subsequent consolidation and linkage of US troops for a reinforced drive in direction of Germany. It was here tending to, I think, assisting wounded personnel from his unit that Jack unfortunately got captured. Jack, could you please tell us a little bit about, first of all, your background, your experience in combat, and then how you got captured, and especially the life in a prisoner of war camp, how that was like, because I understand you were there for 6 months, unfortunately. Thank you.
How much time have you got?
Well, 20 minutes or so, yeah.
Thank you. I just made a bad joke. I asked him how much time did he have. I'll be very brief. For my wife, who should be saying, very quickly, I was like so many guys in all the branches of service today and long ago. I was a teenage kid. I was in the Army. The U.S. 7th Army invaded southern France after the Normandy invasion. That was in the late summer of '44. And I was in an infantry division that moved ashore right after that invasion, and we went up on the line and took part in the combat in northern France. To bring my presentation to a halt, what happened to me, my personal experience was, I was on a 12-man reconnaissance patrol in the Vosges Mountains, which is in northern France. And we had achieved our objective, which was to find a tiny little village and determine the point the platoon leader said, find out the last time the Krauts were there. Well, we got into the village. We did find out from the villagers, a real tiny place, not as big as this room, that the Krauts had been there about a week before. What we didn't know was the Krauts were still in the village watching us out the windows. So we got in the village and went back out again, and the end of my story essentially is this. As we were working our way back to the American lines in the Vosges Mountains in northern France, we were ambushed by 2 German machine guns. We were sitting ducks. They caught us crossing an open field, and they chewed us up. More than half the squad was killed outright, and in my attempts as a 19-year-old kid to try to help a good friend who had been shot in the back, they fired from the back, which is what ambushers do. I was caught by the Germans and spent the final months of the war in a German prison camp. And I can see my wife in the back saying, "That's enough. That's enough. That's enough war stories." But the point is, I'm delighted to be here. I hope you enjoy your visit. And if you want to hear more of this rambling story, I'll see you when I sit down. Okay? Thank you.
Now, come on, Jack. You have to finish your story. We need more. Yeah.
No, but
Prisoner of war camp.
what do you want to hear from me?
The prisoner of war camp.
He's
Tell us about.
He's telling me the prisoner of war camp. Okay, very, very briefly, I promise. I was captured near the end of the war, just about a month before the Battle of the Bulge. I was kept in France a few weeks with the 2 guys I was caught with. And we were, as I say, recon patrol, ambushed on our way back to the American lines. I was caught while I was trying to help a wounded friend. We were taken near into the northern part of France, eventually ended up in a camp near Munich. And there's something up the Germans at that point, of course, because things are going bad for them. But their sources of labor, of course, were shrinking. Most of their young people were in the military. And they were taking women and older men to work, slave laborers and Allied POWs to do all sorts of unskilled work. So one of the things I had to do while I was a prisoner of war, the Germans, with their peculiar way Germans operate, they didn't work commissioned officers or non-commissioned officers who were prisoners. They just kept them locked up. But people like me, privates or corporals, they worked. So I spent some very happy days in the Munich rail yards as a laborer, filling up bomb holes caused by American and British bombers, and also enjoying the chance to watch the German air defense system go into action when the American bombers would come. British bombers bombed at midnight, and we bombed around midday every day. And let me tell you, folks, and forgive me, ladies, when we bomb you, we bomb the hell out of you, okay? We truly did bomb the Germans to the Stone Age. And that was using regular bombs, not the atomic bomb. And you know, I'm very fortunate to be an old man standing here telling you these war stories. A lot of good people long ago, as today, young people, never got to come home. Thank you for being here.
One more question, Jack. Numerous Americans who unfortunately got captured, ended up on the eastern parts of Germany in Stalags, and later on were liberated by Soviet troops. But I understand that you had the privilege of being liberated by your own countrymen. Tell us how that went about.
Forgive me. I see my wife in the back saying, "Don't do that bad joke." I always tell people
Come on, tell us.
I was liberated by George Patton and his band of gypsies, calling themselves the Third Army. God bless them. I say every night in my prayers, God bless George Patton and the U.S. Third Army. The U.S. Third Army overran that part of Germany I was being held in, and specifically 3 Sherman tanks and the 80th Infantry Division, and I was free.
Okay, thank you, Jack. So our next participant is Colonel Candelaria. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly as a non-American. A distinguished flyer. As a combat pilot, he flew missions in P-38s and later on also in Mustangs P-51s. And as I understand it, your personal experience would make a great story for a movie, escaping on a hijacked vehicle. How did you manage to do so? What made you drove or taking those high risks? Was it the bare survival or just a moral obligation as a soldier taken prisoner to escape and continue to resist? So we'd be eager to hear your story, Colonel.
Well, I'd like to tell you that it was my duty to escape, but actually we weren't getting any food. It was near the end of the war. And I wanted to get something to eat, so I found a way, along with 2 others, to escape. But let me lay the foundation for my demise and becoming a prisoner of war. And fortunately or unfortunately, I was never in a stalag. I was never in a prison camp. We were being moved from one town to another, trying to stay ahead of the Allied lines from both sides. But I always wanted to be a fighter pilot. I am a fighter pilot. You don't stop being a fighter pilot any more than you stop being a doctor or a lawyer. So I still consider myself a fighter pilot. And my career started in Southern California. You might say when I was a teenage boy and I was reading G8 and his Flying Aces and the Red Baron and all of the World War I comic books. But at any rate, I really wanted to fly a fighter, period. And fortunately, in Southern California, we had various aircraft factories, such as Lockheed and North American Aviation and Douglas and so on, so that I got a chance to see aircraft. Got my first ride when I was 8 years old, and open cockpit, two-wing with struts and wires and fabric, and I just loved it. At any rate, once I grew up, I was still in high school, and they were starting to build a P-38 at Lockheed at Burbank, California. So I'd ride my bicycle up to the top of the mountain, look down where they were taking off and landing, and saying, oh, one of these days I've just got to fly one of those. Long story short, I had to have 2 years of college, so I entered University of Southern California, USC, who, by the way, is going to whip California University today. And, and we're going to go play, I don't know whether it's going to be Michigan or that other outfit, but at any rate, for the championship. But all I wanted was my 2 years. I was working at the same time in an instrument factory, and of all things, we were making instruments for aircraft and tanks, but aircraft. So I was still happy. However, I was itching to go. I put in my application, and fortunately, I was accepted for possible pilot training. I was surfing on the beach there in January, believe it or not, in Southern California, and we get orders, and we don't know where we're going, but the train starts going eastward and going and going. Ended up in Nashville, Tennessee. Now there, the weather was at a little bit of snow on the ground, about 2 feet, and it was around 20 degrees, but at least I was at the classification center. In 10 days, I was classified as a pilot, and all of us ran up to the bulletin board to see if our names were on it, and great, I was on it. Well, they put me on the train back to California, over to Santa Ana. You know, the Army Air Corps was so efficient, they could have sent me on the red streetcar down to Santa Ana from Santa Monica. No, they had to send me to Nashville and train and back. At any rate, I started my pre-flight in Santa Ana, California, went on to primary in Oxnard, California, and then to Chico, California for basic. Fortunately for me, when I told my instructors I wanted to be a fighter pilot, they did recommend me for that. I had some great instructors. At any rate, I ended up then in Arizona at the Twin Engine Fighter School at Chandler, Arizona. They were flying P-38s. Actually, they were called 322s because they didn't have the turbo superchargers to go to altitude. When I graduated, got my wings, my little butter bar, and I thought, oh, I'm in heaven. Then I got the orders. I was crushed. Guys were going to the Pacific. They were going here and there. I was to be an instructor. Well, after gnashing my teeth for a while, I stayed at Williams Field, or Willie Patch as we called it, flying the P-38s. And then I was sent to across the town to Luke Field, and they had P-40 there, which is single engine. They made me a flight instructor and gunnery and in instruments, and thank God for those two things. After about, I think it was nearly 4 months, excuse me, it was the 5th month, the call came for fighter pilots, if anybody wanted to volunteer. Well, I almost got trampled in the rush to headquarters. And we signed up. I was sent to Louisiana, not far from here, a place called Harding Field at Baton Rouge, just up the highway. And that was my operational training unit. From there on to Colorado Springs, where now we have the Air Force Academy, and to Pierce, South Dakota for gunnery, then back to Louisiana, last Cajun dinner, and off to New Jersey, aboard a boat and a huge convoy, and I got to England, sent to my fighter group, the 479th Fighter Group, comprised of 3 fighter squadrons, the 434th, the 435th, and the 436th. I was in the 435th, and on my cap, my squadron, not too long ago, gave me this cap, and it's got the Black Eagle logo, which was the logo of the 435th Fighter Squadron, which is still active today, by the way. I'll tell you more about it some other time, but from there, it was time to start flying missions. First missions were over France, and the next missions were from Germany all the way to France to clear out the Luftwaffe. Of course, we knew it was going to be for the invasion. We had no idea when or where, and if we had known, we wouldn't have told anyone anyway. But the flying went on, and when I arrived at my group, I was delighted. They were flying P-38s, twin-engine fighters with 4 machine guns out the nose and a 20-millimeter cannon. I thought, boy, I'm back in heaven. And fortunately for us, we were in an RAF base at Ipswich, England, and it was a permanent RAF base. And the RAF treated their pilots very, very well. No Quonset huts, no Nissen huts, no tents. A beautiful building. We lived in the club, and it was called the Country Club, if you heard. Ipswich, Boxted, or Debden. It was neat. However, it had a very short runway. And they had a group that came in and started building another runway, which was to be much longer. They did finish it. I think it was something like May 25th, 1945. But at any rate, in spite of the short runway, we were able to operate out of there, and our primary missions were escort missions, not to take the bombers to a dance, but to keep the fighters from getting to them. And the escort missions might take anywhere from 4 hours to 7 hours and 45 minutes. One mission I logged 7 hours and 52 minutes, and I found out somebody else had logged 53 minutes, and I thought, how come it took you so long to land? But at any rate, our missions were to take the bombers wherever they went and to protect them. And the way we flew was I have to come back to the P-38s. We were flying P-38s. About 2 months later, they brought in P-51s. Our squadron was the first one to fly P-51s. So we would fly our missions, our escort missions, with 2 squadrons of P-38s and 1 squadron of P-51, which was my squadron. Then we flew 2 squadrons of P-51s and 1 squadron of P-38s. And finally, we were flying P-51 Mustangs. And because of the range of the Mustang, the long legs that it had, we could go anywhere that the bombers went. We went to Czechoslovakia, we went to the edge of Poland, we went into Russia and back. We didn't go on any shuttle runs, but it could have been a shuttle run because we're pretty well exhausted. Now remember that you're sitting in a fighter, and the fighter, it's about this wide, shouldn't be any wider anyway, and you're sitting there for, let's say, 5 hours, and you really can't move. The only thing you can move, of course, are your hands and your neck. Why do you move your neck? In fact, we wore a white scarf, silk or nylon. not to look good, not to look rakish, but because it would keep our neck from chafing, because you were constantly looking for a 109 or a Focke-Wulf 190 coming up on your tail, and because that's the guy that's going to shoot you down if you don't see him. So we would go with the bombers wherever they went. Then, if we had enough fuel and we hadn't run into any opposition, by that I mean the Luftwaffe fighters, why then we would take the bombers to landfall out, which was the edge of the continent, and they would go on to England. And if we had enough fuel and we had ammunition, we'd go back in, go down to low level and start looking for targets of opportunity. Go after airfields, trucks, tanks, locomotives. Oh, locomotives. Those are fun because they get all kinds of steam and so on. But not only that, it stopped the train. And once in a while, you'd see a Red Cross railroad wagon. You'd say, oh, don't shoot at it. One fellow didn't happen to see the Red Cross on it, so he went down and he shot at it, and we were all telling him, pull up, pull up. It's a good thing we said pull up, because as he fired, about 3 wagons blew up. So they weren't carrying sick and wounded, they were carrying ammunition, but putting the Red Crosses on there so we wouldn't attack them. We called those fighter sweeps, and once in a while we would have a fighter sweep. Now, when we went to protect the bombers, we would have 2 squadrons that were called Snow White. Why Snow White? Well, because you stayed with the bombers. You never left the bombers. If enemy fighters came, and sometimes you'd get the jets coming through and they'd make a sweep trying to draw you away, which they often did. But if the 2 squadrons that were Snow White had to stay with the bombers, you couldn't chase them. But you had Outlaw Squadron, and we used to play musical chairs with that. One squadron would be Outlaw one day, and the next day would be another squadron. So the Outlaw Squadrons got to not only chase the enemy aircraft, but to go looking for them before they rose and came toward the bombers, or try to intercept them en route. Those were the fun ones. And those, of course, got a chance to go down and strafe airfields and, if at all possible, get some victories. Our squadron did quite well. I'm going to tell you about 2 particular missions. One mission, we were escort, and we were Outlaw Squadron. And a gaggle, when I say a gaggle, because, you know, there's a gaggle of geese. Well, sometimes you'd see those formations, whereas we flew the typical fingertip 4 in each flight, and then you'd have 4 to 5 flights. Usually 4 and sometimes 5 if there were 20 of you flying. This particular day we'd had bad weather and bad maintenance or whatever, and there were 10 of us, plus one other squadron who had lost about, I think 4 or 5 out of their midst. But we were vectored, because you had someone on the ground that was 2 things. They would listen to the radios, and you had what they called the rats, and these were WAF, Royal Air Force, women that spoke German. They would listen to the German frequencies, and they could tell us when they were rising from a certain area. The Luftwaffe would bring squadrons down from Norway, up from Romania, from Czechoslovakia, if we were headed toward Berlin. And of course, the Berlin patrol was always up. These consisted of Focke-Wulf 190s, single-engine fighters, a radial engine, and sometimes the Me-109, which is a really good bird, and that was a long nose like ours, inline engine. The jets, of course, were up there, and they would always be above us, and we encountered them first in August of 1944. And they became more and more numerous. However, they almost never actually got into a dogfight with us, because we could outmaneuver them. But they would make a pass and then keep going, and we'd chase them and just go out of sight. So we gave that up after a while. But on this particular mission, they didn't have any jets up, or if they were somewhere else. but there was a mixed bag of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Me-109s, and you could see that they were heading for the bombers, but they were still about 80 miles, 50 to 80 miles away. There was 82 of them, and we had been left, our squadron had 10, and the group commander was flying with us, and he called a bounce. When you say you call a bounce, you're going to bounce the aircraft. That means you're going to go engage them, you're going to go attack them. The idea was you hit them and you bounce back up, I guess. At any rate, he called a bounce, and I was flying wing and one of the flight commanders, and we got right into the middle of them. I saw him shoot one down. About that time, about 6 more lined up, and 4 of them came at him. So I turned into them, let him know that they were trying to get on his tail, and I shot one of them down. And about that time, why he started chasing another one, and something like 4 or 5 more, I could see them breaking into me from the right. These were Focke-Wulf 190s. And I had to protect myself, so I advised them that I was going to have to engage them. And we went around and around for a while, and they started diving for the clouds, but I was able to shoot down 1 more. So that day I shot down 2 Focke-Wulf 190s and kept him from getting shot down. So we went back home and we celebrated, had a few pints, and then we had a bottle of scotch, and somebody offered us some champagne. By that time, we couldn't handle it anyway. The next big mission, we had other missions that were pretty interesting. I can tell you that often we would chase the aircraft, enemy aircraft, because they would come at the bombers, and our job was to try to fend them off. Now, unfortunately, not like football where you can block. No, they have to be within 50 caliber range, and you have to be behind them. And if they're in front of you, that's fine. But if they're behind you, you have to work them out in front of you, do whatever you have to do. And that's where my instructor experience came in handy, because I had more time than the other lieutenants that were in the squadron. And as a result, I had a little bit of an edge, because you learn about flying when you've got a 280-pound tackle from Notre Dame or a USC in the cockpit, and he's desperately trying to put you away by diving the airplane into the ground, and you're sitting there trying to wrestle the stick away from him. And when you finally do, you get even with him. You pull it up to where it's almost all the controls are wishy-washy, and you beat the bejesus out of his knees and let him know that he shouldn't do that anymore. The next mission that was interesting to me, well, there are many more in between, but this one was on the 7th of April. And the Germans had put up a maximum effort because we were going to Berlin. And they hit the bombers before they got into German territory. Now, I was going to lead the yellow section, which was one of the sections of the squadron we flew. Each squadron had 2 sections and 2 leaders. And lo and behold, I started to taxi out, and I felt I got a call from the tower, and they said, pull over to the right, you have to stop. So I pulled over to the right, and they said, you have a flat tail wheel. Oh, no. Well, it doesn't sound like something real bad, but if you're trying to maneuver an airplane that has drop tanks, you're carrying another 600 to 800 pounds of fuel on the wings, not internally, but on the wings, and you're trying to take off on a short runway, that tail wheel better roll. Also, when you come into land, you're liable to do a cute arabesque at the end of the runway and end up on your nose. So I pulled over, disappointed, and my crew chief and my armor came running up, and they told me not to get out of the airplane because I'd shut the engine off. They said, don't get out, we'll have you going in no time. So sure enough, I felt the tail go up, and they put a new tail wheel, but by that time, the squadron you take off in 2s, and then you form into flights, then you form to the squadron, a great big circle, and you start climbing out. Now the weather was, it was overcast at about 800 feet. So right after they took off, they more or less disappeared. Well, I started my engine and I saw the last two turning and disappearing into the clouds. But I figured, well, I can catch up with them. So I went ahead and took off. And being alone, I didn't have to worry about flying formation and jockeying the throttle. So I set course 2 degrees off and set course for the rendezvous point, because you knew where the rendezvous point was with the bombers, because there's no sense in escorting them over the North Sea when you aren't going to have enemy fighters. You have to be there when the enemy fighters show up. By cutting them off and being alone, I got to the rendezvous point first. And about that time, just as I got there, I called the squadron. I said, I'm at rendezvous point. They said, well, we're about 3 minutes from there. We'll be there in 3 minutes. And about that time, I saw these 2 jets coming toward the formation. Fortunately, they were at lower altitude along the track of the bombers, and I was above them. So I could pick up speed. And as they came toward the bombers, I intercepted them by going at them head on. And I still had my wing tanks on, which had 200 gallons of fuel. As they went under me, I pulled something foolish. I said, I'll drop my tanks. I did, but of course I missed them anyway. But the one that was coming at me head on, he avoided me by diving down slightly, and he went underneath me, so I couldn't possibly hit him. But they swung out. I made them swing out, and they turned around to come back to the bombers. I was able to cut them off in the turn, and I got on the leader. And as he was pulling away from me, I fired at him, and I saw strikes in the cockpit, and I saw strikes in the right engine. It began to smoke. And as he was pulling away from me, I couldn't see anymore. And about that time, I thought, well, I'll give it one more burst. And it had been a very short burst, actually. And I looked in the mirror, and here's the other jet right behind me, and I see his nose light up like a neon sign. That meant he was firing at me. So I broke and dove down, and he missed me, but he hit the wingtip and knocked off my navigation light, so no big damage. And I took on after both of them, and I saw the one just roll over and start down. He was going straight down at high speed. He entered the undercast, which was the low clouds, at about 6,000 feet. And now that I have flown jets and I know how much room you need to pull out of a dive at that speed, I would have called it a confirmed kill. But instead, when I was asked, well, did you see him crash? No. Did you see him bail out? No. What did you see? Well, I saw him enter the undercast. Are you going to claim him as a kill? No. He was a probable. Okay. Anyway, the other one went after him, and there was no way I could catch him. And I heard the bombers calling that there were fighters, so I climbed back up. And as I climbed up above them, I saw them firing green flares. That meant there were enemy fighters in sight. And I looked, and the squadron hadn't arrived yet. They were still maybe 30 seconds away. And I saw these 15 to 16 Messerschmitt 109s in a formation, and they had a leader, and he had a bright yellow nose. All the others had camouflage paint, but this one wanted to be seen because he had this long yellow nose, and I found out why. Because I thought to myself, well, I have to stop them. You know, that's why I'm in a fighter. I'm supposed to fight. So I picked the leader. Again, a mistake. There was a reason why he wanted to be seen. He was good. So for about, it seemed like half an hour, but it turned out to be only about 20 or 30, maybe 40 seconds. We went round and round. And I had a tiger by the tail because this guy was so good. Every time I'd start to get him in my sights, he'd do something real fancy, and he'd lose me. I'd have to work him out in front of me again. But the good thing that he was so good is that his squadron, they weren't as good as he was. They were having trouble keeping up with us, and I was so close to him that if they fired at me, they'd hit him. So at any rate, I finally hit him. Even though it was a short burst, he started spilling coolant and oil, and smoke, and then he caught fire and he spiraled down, and I kept trying to see if I could get another shot at him, but the canopy came off, he bailed out, and I saw his chute open. I thought, well, good. And then I remembered, I've got a hornet's nest around me because all these others are now free to come at me. And sure enough, about that time, I saw these looked like glowing golf balls going by. Those were 20 millimeter cannon shells. That's what you see. So it's time to put the stick over in the corner and start kicking the rudders. At any rate, I had no choice but to engage them. So we did. We went round and round, and fortunately, as a boy, I'd gotten an air rifle and had learned to shoot at birds on the wing, and then I got a .22. And so I was familiar with a gun and how to lead a moving target, because I didn't have time to use my gun sight. Everything was happening so fast that I could see black crosses on my right, black crosses on my left, and under me and above me. Well, heck, I couldn't miss. All I had to do was close my eyes, pull the trigger. Well, it wasn't quite that way, but almost. So I shot one down as he went past me. I pulled the nose up, and I pulled the trigger, and a big ball of fire came out from under the nose. About that time, another one came from the left, and he was firing at me, so I ducked the nose down and did a barrel roll, and he slid by. I hit him, and he blew up. The third one came up behind me on the left, and as I broke into him, we started rolling. We got into a luffberry. Luffberry is a big circle. You're each trying to get on each other's tail. At any rate, when I hit him, he went in and he just cartwheeled. I didn't see a parachute come out. One of them he did get out. So I'd shot down 4 ME-109s about that time, just when I was getting panicky because, you know, I still had a whole bunch more. 3 of the squadron came down. Lieutenant Barsky, King, and Williams came down, and they saw the last action. They saw the one explode in the air, and they saw 2 hit the ground. So I had some witnesses. So, because if you're alone, you can't prove that you shot down another airplane. You have to have a witness. So they witnessed it, and we circled them, and we climbed back up, and we went down to the target, and I had to leave after the target. I had to leave earlier because I dropped my tank, so I didn't have enough fuel. Got home, and I had 4 kills that day, so I became an ace because I had 2 other kills. Thank you. Thank you. You know, the French started this in World War I, and to become an ace, you have to shoot down 5 or more. Once you get to 5, you're an ace. You can shoot 20 or 6 or 10, but once you hit 5, you're an ace. And I was the only ace of the squadron and remain the only ace of the squadron up to now. If there's another shooting war, which there is going on, and the enemy come up, why, we may have more aces. At any rate, now I'm all happy, you know, I'm an ace, and I hear that my order's going to come through to become a captain. I'm a flight commander now. They had me go to London and do a radio broadcast and that kind of stuff to tell about that particular mission. So now we're going to Berlin again. And this is the 13th of April. This is Friday the 13th. Pay attention, stay in bed on Friday the 13th. I should have. At any rate, we were outlaw squadron, which meant we could leave the bombers, go look for enemy aircraft or targets of opportunity. Well, one of the big games was to go after airfields. There's only one trouble with airfields. The Germans don't like to see their aircraft shot up on the ground, and they have some great anti-aircraft people. I have a lot of respect for them. No admiration, but a lot of respect, because they were good. They could bracket you. You were at 35,000 feet, and all of a sudden they'd bracket you. That meant that the next ones were going to be where you were, so you'd better start diving down, making turns, and until you were out of range. And they always greeted you when you were at landfall in, that meant that you were at the coast of the continent. Even if it was clouded over, you knew you were at landfall in because here would come the burst of flak. I guess I was shot at, let me see, I don't think there was one mission where I wasn't shot at. I wasn't hit always, but I was shot at. But at this particular mission, we thought, well, we'll go down and we'll look for airfields and we'll shoot them up. Well, we went to the edge of Prussia, right on the border of Poland. Possibly you Europeans know about this. Rostock is right on the water and on the Baltic Sea. And we found this airfield, and man, there's a lot of aircraft down there. So what you did to check for flak, the anti-aircraft fire was called flak. Today it's called AAA or whatever. But when you check for flak, you go above it about 15,000 feet. You roll over on your back to pick up speed. You go full throttle down, dive, and start firing at any target that you have, then pull across and stay low so that they can't shoot at you as you're on the rise. Go in between trees or whatever and pull away. You never go back for a second pass. This is what I kept telling my flight. Stupid me. I said, hey, I saw the 2 batteries that are firing. There were 2 88 batteries that were firing. And they're in line. If I take this track, I can knock out this battery and that battery, and we can set up a traffic pattern and just shoot up the airfield, because there's a lot of airplanes in the airfield. It's just like a candy shop. So I said, stay up here, I'm going down, and I'm going to knock out the batteries. So instead of a steep dive, I made a more shallow dive because I wanted to line them up. And I started firing at the first battery, and all of a sudden on peripheral vision, here are all these camouflages coming out, and here are all these guns. The place lit up like a Christmas tree. I'm sure all of you have seen a 4th of July, an Independence Day fireworks show. Have you seen these little bursts of rockets and so forth? Multiply that about 200 or 300. That's what you see as you're coming down. And naturally, they hit me. Well, actually, they put it out in front of me, and I ran into it. A 20 millimeter did come through the cockpit and hit the instrument panel and exploded on the firewall, the engine firewall. So some of the pieces of metal and from the instrument panel and glass, flew and hit me. But that's another story right now. My oil pressure went down to 0, and I could see the coolant temperature going up. I put it in manual, opened up the coolant place, and I called the guys, hey, I'm hit, and we need to get out of here. It's too hot. The hot meant something different in those days. That meant it was nasty. So I headed toward the Allied lines. We were way in the north. We were, as I say, East Prussia, which is now, I think it's part of Poland now, but anyway, it was northeast of Berlin. So they called and they said, well, do you want to go to air sea rescue? Maybe you can make it to Sweden. And I was looking at the temperature, and it was wheezing and coughing, and I said, I don't think I'm going to make it that far. So I headed for the lines, and I said, give me the closest steer for the Allied lines. And we knew where they were because there was a bomb line, and you weren't supposed to shoot on one side, and sometimes you missed. But anyway, you didn't shoot on that side, so that was a safe haven. I thought, if I could make it to Brussels, I got it made. There's no way I was going to make it. So pretty soon, I felt, all this hot liquid. I went out and blood. I didn't feel any pain. Pieces of shrapnel, I guess, had gone through my wrist, one had gone through my arm, and although my Mae West, thank God, had slowed down some of the pieces. Some had embedded in my beloved pink skin, and I wasn't too happy about that because it was like a shower here. But, it wasn't bad. Now, the scalp wound, if you ever had a scalp wound, you know that you bleed like mad, but it's not serious. Well, I didn't know it. Wow, good gosh, I got a lot of blood. I kept flying, and I said, hey, I'm not going to make it. And they said, well, maybe you could make it just to the river, the Elba River, that is, and the other side where the Allies were coming up. And I said, no, it's getting very hot and I smell smoke. And they said, well, my nickname was Candy. What else would you call a Candelaria? Who's going to say the whole Candelaria bit? So they said, Candy, you're on fire. Well, it's time to leave. So I said, I'm getting out. And I started pulling the oxygen mask and the anti-G suit back, bailed out. And I heard them say, there he goes. You know, the last thing that came off was the earphones. And pulled the, I tried to slow down. First put my arms out and my legs. And sure enough, you know, it's not bad. And I pulled the D-ring and that heavenly jerk, the chute opened and, oh, well, I'm okay. And everything becomes quiet. There's been a lot of noise, you know, engine noise, guns firing and so forth. All of a sudden, everything is quiet and peaceful, and you're just swinging there. You could almost enjoy it, except I thought, whoops, I'm over Germany. So came down in this field, and there was an open field, and there were a bunch of woods, and there was a haystack. And I thought, not the haystack. That's the first place they're going to look, because I started running for it, and the squadron was above me, and they could see it. And they came back, reported they had seen me running to the haystack. Well, I didn't stay there. But because they saw me running, they knew I was okay. Oh, I went back to the woods, got deep in the woods, took off the yellow Mae West. And so, man, it's pretty holy here. And I checked myself, and I wasn't really hurt badly. There was a lot of blood all over the place, but, you know, nothing serious. So I buried the Mae West, buried the parachute, and started walking through the woods. This was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I waited for dark. I kept going through the woods, and I came to a lake. I thought, oh, if I can get in the water, maybe if they try to track me with dogs, which later on they did, I'll just swim across the lake. I took my .45 out and I put it in my boots, these big fur-lined boots, put it in there. Actually, the gun would have fired anyway. I didn't have to put it in the boots, but anyway, I backstroked across the lake, and fortunately it was a small lake. Got on the other side and I hid out for a while. Then for the next 10 days I was loose. I was evading, and I kept walking, and I learned that I should travel at night, because if you make movement, somebody's going to see you. But if you stay very still and you hide someplace, why, they'll miss you. Then at night you could start going. There's only one trouble. Sometimes they put barbed wire in these hedges, and you go and run into a hedge, and whoops, it's not very pleasant. I kept going for about 2 days. I ran out of the emergency rations, and I was fine, and came into this open field, and I looked around. There was nobody there, didn't see anybody, and there was some woods. So I said, well, if I cut across the field, I'll make better time instead of going all the way around through the woods, and I'll hit the woods on the other end. I'll keep going. I got about a quarter of the way across the field, and all of a sudden I heard, halt! And I saw 2 soldiers. They had black uniforms. It was the Panzer Division with the red piping and their little garrison hat. They didn't have helmets, but they had rifles. And, well, it's time to give up. So I took off my white scarf with a little scarlet on it, and I waved it. I'm ready to surrender. And they raised their rifles and they fired. Now, they didn't seem to really take good aim because they missed me. So I hit the ground, which is a natural thing to do, and I took off my scarf and I waved it above me, and I heard them fire again, and I could hear the round be heard. Before I heard the report of the rifle, I heard the whistling through the tall grass and the weeds, and I could hear the thud of the round as it hit the ground. So, boy, these guys are serious. So I didn't wave anymore. I started crawling. But they could see, because of the way the grass was moving, that I was moving, and I heard them fire again. So then I rolled, and I found a place where it was a little thicker, but I could still see out. I didn't think, well, they couldn't see me, but I could see them. And I kept trying to get lower and lower on the ground, and I couldn't. There was a big lump here. Yeah, that's my 45. It's a handgun you carry. So I reached for it, and I got it out, and I put a cartridge in, and I said, well, I hope I don't have to use it. Those guys got rifles. They came closer, and they were holding them waist high. And they were they were talking to each other, and I couldn't tell if they were laughing or not. And since I didn't speak German, I didn't know what they were saying. I learned quite a bit more later, but that's another story. Anyway, as they got closer and closer, this one fellow was coming right straight for me, and I said, well, if I roll, he'll see the bushes and the grass move, and he'll know where I'm going. So I just was quiet, and I took my 45, put it on the ground, and I aimed right at his belt buckle. The biggest margin of error, right? Well, as he got closer and closer, he saw me, and he started to raise his rifle, and I pulled the trigger, and I must have blinked, because the next thing I saw was not his belt buckle, but the soles of his boots as he went over backwards, just knocked him flat. The other one whirled toward me, but before he could raise his rifle, I fired 2 rounds at him. I hit him in one shoulder because he spun around, his rifle flew out, and the next one hit him in the chest. He went down, and we just lay there. I didn't move, and they didn't move, and nobody moved for about 5 minutes. Then I crawled up to the first one. I found out I'd missed what I had been aiming at, because instead of hitting him in the belt buckle, I'd hit him in the forehead. And there was a good-sized hole in the front of his forehead, and the whole back of his skull was gone. It was just gone, period. So I crawled over to the next one, and I could see that, yes, this one I'd hit in the shoulder and somewhere in the chest. I couldn't tell where. So I said, it's time to get out of here. And I thought, well, I'll take the rifles. I'll have a pistol and a couple of rifles. Then I thought, no, they'll see that they've been shot with a 45. They're not dumb. And I have the rifles. Oh, no. So I left the rifles there, and I changed direction. I headed straight south now instead of southwest, trying to head to the American lines. I thought I was pretty safe. I got maybe 10 or 15 kilometers away. Now, you can do without food, but you can't do without water. Notice. Because without water, pretty soon you pass out. So I was looking for water. Now, in the mornings, I could lick the grass and get some of the dew. But I found this stream in this field, and there was a wagon with hay on it, and there wasn't a soul around. So I thought, well, there's some cows over there, and the stream here, and there's nobody around. I'll go get a drink, and I can fill my little bag. You get a little rubber bag, and you get halazone tablets, and you can purify the water. I wouldn't have cared if I purified it or not. So I took a drink, and I filled my little bag. And as I got through filling it, putting the halazone tablets, I heard, oh. I looked up, oh no, there's 2 German fellows. I guess they were farmers. And they have these 2-tine pitchforks. I don't know if you've seen them. They're curved. They have very sharp points. And they were running toward me. I thought, oh, no. As they got closer, I saw those pitchforks, the way they were handling them, and we knew of stories where flyers had been pinned to a tree by pitchforks while they were waiting for the military authorities. So this time it was easier. I pulled out the gun, and as they got close enough, because I'd find out if they're too far away, I'm going to miss them completely. So when they were about 10 yards away, I went ahead and fired. They hadn't seen my gun, but when I turned around and pointed at them, all of a sudden their expressions changed. But I had no choice. I had to shoot. So both of them went down, and this time I didn't bother to look where I'd hit them. I started then running back the way I came in the kept going, traveled for about 4 more days. I think it was something like a total of 10 days when I was finally captured, and this is the way I was captured. I got to a point where there was a town down below, and there were some little cabins, and some teenage kids and a woman were gathering firewood. I assume it was for fire, but they were gathering wood as they were coming up the hill. I was sitting on this log, and I tried not to move, and then I just couldn't stand it any longer. As they got closer and closer, they were going to see me. I got up and turned around and walked into the woods without looking back until I got behind a tree. And they went and gathered wood for a little longer, and they disappeared. So I waited for a little while, then I heard some aircraft coming. I hear some British Typhoons. I hear them firing, and they're firing at something, and they went away. And I went to the cabins, and I looked in one of them, and I couldn't see anybody inside. Went to the next one. I couldn't see anybody through the window, so I went to the door, and it was unlocked. So I went in there, and I thought, there's bound to be food in here. So I looked and looked, no food, but there was a bottle of wine. I thought, oh boy, at least I'll have some wine. So I took a big swig. Oh, vinegar. So I was just about the time I put the bottle down through the window, I see these helmets coming, and now these were Army people and a bunch of civilians with them. They come around to the front, toward the front, so I got behind the door, and a sergeant came in. I could tell he was a sergeant. He had a helmet, and he was saying, "Hello, hello," and I got back and didn't move, and I looked over to my left. There's a big blue eye looking at me through the crack, and they call him. He went out. Pretty soon I see this face coming around, and it's the sergeant. Well, I have to give up. So I went ahead and went out, and they were pointing at me, the civilians were, and they were saying, "Civil, civil." And I didn't say anything, but I remembered that they had Italians running around. I've got black hair, brown eyes, so I said, "Sono Italiano." Well, that didn't work, because one of the civilians reached over and unzipped my flight suit, and there's my .45. So the sergeant reached in and pulled it out, and he looked at it. He had a beautiful 7.65 Walther, beautiful little gun. He pulled it out and he said, "Oh, artillery." And I thought, by gosh, here's my chance. He likes my gun. Now, remember, I had fired 5 shots. Well, what I had done is I had taken the clip, or the old clip, out with 1 round, and I had taken the round out, and I had buried the clip and put in a fresh clip, so I had the full 6 rounds in there. But the gun had been fired. They would know it. So since he looked like he liked my gun, I pointed at a tree away from the rest of them, and I made the sign. So he took me up on it, and he fired twice. Well, there were 2 rounds gone. The gun had been fired, but he'd fired them. Maybe I'd never fired, so gave a sigh of relief. Anyway, that was just the beginning of my problems, because I had a hunting knife in my boot, and they took that, and of course they made me take my boots off, and we wore brown shoes, right, with our uniform. And I've got my pinks and greens on, and although there's a big stain over here, still, to them, I looked like a civilian, and they kept saying that I was a spy. And here comes this great big Todd organization guy. You probably know who they are. They wear a brown uniform. They're like land Seabees. They're construction people. Anyway, oh, he was big. And he came along with the others, and of course they grabbed me, and they were taking me to town. And this one fellow told me that airplanes had just hit a little girl, when they were firing, and here I am, a pilot, I've got wings and so forth, and they're dragging me down to the village, and I see they've got a rope. By God, they're gonna hang me. So I said, well, this isn't good, and I didn't know whether to give them the satisfaction of having me fight and kick and scream and bite and whatever. So I said, no, I won't give them that pleasure. I'll just be very calm. Wasn't calm inside, but outside I made believe I was calm. And the soldiers were trying to tell them, no, no, you know, they're ours. About this time, the sergeant ran off someplace. And in about 2 minutes, he came up, and there's a German officer, an Oberleutnant, a first lieutenant. He was a little guy with curly blonde hair and quite young looking. And he went up to this great big guy, and he had to look up at him, and he started yelling at him. And the big fellow started arguing with him, and pretty soon he said, "Jawohl, jawohl, jawohl." And then the lieutenant turned to me and he said, "Everything's all right." He said, you're under our protection and command now." And he said, "You know, I have relatives in Wisconsin." I said, "Oberleutnant, I'll look them up for you." Which I did, and I never found them. But anyway, I was okay now, and I was under the protection of the German army. By the way, the German army, the Wehrmacht, treated me the best of everybody. They, in fact, when I was among them, they said, "You're a soldier, I'm a soldier. When this is over, we'll all go home." I was never in a prison camp because by that time, things were chaotic. You have to remember this was April, and we were being moved from town to town, staying ahead of the lines. And we saw a lot, and we had the towns that we went through, they would line the road and they would throw rocks at us. Fortunately for me, when I finally wound up with this group, well, I should tell you that I stayed with the Army for about 2 days, and I finally got fed, and they fed me exactly what they were eating. Not only that, but when they went to turn me into the Air Force, they gave me a piece of cheese, they gave me hunks of bread, and they gave me soap. Oh, that was a luxury, soap. And best of all, they were going to give me a drink of schnapps. Someone said, "No, no, good stuff." Here comes a bottle of Martel Cordon Bleu cognac. So they gave me a nice big swig of that, and of course, not eating very much, boy, I felt real good after that. But anyway, they were like comrades. They treated me well. One incident, the next day I was to get fed. I was going to have lunch with them, and this was an open field, and there was a kitchen over there, a field kitchen, of course. And I sat down and they gave me this bowl, and it was a bowl of some kind of a grain, but oh man, it tasted good. And about that time we hear airplanes, and all of a sudden somebody yelled something, and they jumped up and they all ran to the side. And I'm sitting there knowing not what to do, and I figured if I get up and run, they could shoot me. They think I'm trying to escape. And I looked up and I saw the 2 aircraft coming down. They happened to be Typhoons. And from their angle, I could see that there was no way they could hit me because they were aiming at some guns that were across the road. In fact, I'm pretty sure they were quad 40s, but they were on wheels. And that's what they were aiming at. And I could see there was no way they could hit me. They'd have to dive down to hit me. I knew they wouldn't do that. So I just sat there, and gee, I was eating for the first time in a long time, so I kept right on eating, and they fired, and they hit, and they took off and went away. And then all the soldiers got up, and they came over, and they said, "Oh, brave soldat, brave soldat." Heck no, I just want to keep eating. Anyway, they turned me over to the Luftwaffe. They took me to an airfield. Now listen to how nice these guys. Number one, the only German song I knew was Lily Marlene. I sang it in English, and I can't sing worth a darn, but they sang it in German, and we were all drinking and drinking cognac and whatever. We got to the airfield, and listen to how nice these guys were. Number one, they went in and opened up the little cell where I was, and there was a straw mattress. I guess it was straw. And they went over and they looked at it, and they came back and said, "Don't sleep there." You know, bugs. So I said, no, they were talking about bed bugs. So no, I slept on the concrete. But then they gave me a raw onion. Do you know why? the commanding officer was going to come by, or the officer was going to take charge. They didn't want him to smell the alcohol on me, so it told me to chew this raw onion. You know, I don't like raw onions, but I chewed it anyway. Besides, it was food. At any rate, I was in there for one night. And the next day, I was supposed to get lunch. But here comes some P-47s, fighter bombers from the 9th Air Force, and they beat up that field. They were dropping bombs and whatnot, and I was thinking, oh, guys, go away. You know, who needs you? After they were gone, the guards came and they said, well, there won't be any lunch. Oh, why not? Well, we got bombed, and so, you know, lunch is out. Oh, no. And that afternoon, I was still under the command of the Air Force, and they took me to a little barn and put me in there. And who's lying on the straw? A guy by the name of Thatcher. There's a big story about Thatcher. Anyway, Thatcher looked at me, and we had gone through operational training together, and he said, Candy, what are you doing here? I said, Thatch, what are you doing here? Silly thing, you know. And so he'd gone to the 4th Fighter Group. He'd been shot down over an airfield, and I told him how I got shot down. And there were just the two of us. They marched us to some other place, and here came 5 or 6 more. Then pretty soon here come 2 bomber crews, and then British bomber crews and American bomber crews. And I had seen one of them get shot down by anti-aircraft. And I had seen one of the gunners, when he was coming down, I had circled him, and he had waved at me. And when I told him what my airplane looked like and the markings on it, he was the one I had seen circling. That's how funny things are. Anyway, I was never in a prison camp, so it was easy to get away. The very first night, one of the first things I did was look to see where I was. It was a little firehouse. I'm assuming it was a little firehouse because they had hoses and ladders in it. And they had taken out bricks in a cross, similar to a cross, and to get air in there. So I went up the ladder and I looked out, and some of the bricks were loose, so I loosened more, and I kept loosening them. I had a hole big enough, and it was getting dark. I went out to the front, and the guards are out in front, and they're smoking and talking to each other. So I just crawled out the hole, dropped to the ground, was quiet, and took off. About 2 hours later, I hear the dogs. And then I can see lights. Oh, no. So I was tired. I was weak. So I just sat down and waited for them. In about 6 or 7 minutes, here they come. Here come the dogs. The dogs ringed me and barked at me, but they didn't attack me. They just kept barking. They were well trained, I guess. Anyway, I had no sense in going up a tree because I'd be treed and they'd still get me. So they came and they took me, and they laughed. They thought it was real funny. Now remember, they're still the Army. They were nice guys. And, but then when we started joining up with all these others, almost all of them were bomber crews. There was one fellow who was a fighter bomber, but I was the only fighter pilot, escort pilot. So all the bomber crews, they treated me very well. As a matter of fact, I told you that we would walk through the streets of a town and they would throw rocks at us. Well, these 2 big guys, McDonald from Palo Alto, California, and Vanderlinder from Burbank, California, they were all tall and big, and they would get on either side of me to protect me from the rocks. But I found out that if you didn't cringe and you didn't duck, if you just kept walking straight ahead, they stopped throwing at you and throw at the other guys that were cringing. Finally, we got to where we stayed in one place, then we moved to another and another. Now here's where Thatch comes in. Thatcher was what you would call black Irish, I guess. He had black hair, jet black hair, and blue eyes, and great big eyelashes, dark eyelash. He was a matinee idol if you've ever seen one. He was about 5'10", and just a real good-looking kid. Well, we were in this yard. We were near a prison camp. They put us in a yard, and they put this barbed wire around, and they had, of course, the machine guns sitting on the floor waiting to aim at us. But, you know, they were pretty lax about it. But some German girls came, I don't know, 18, 20, 25, it was hard to tell. They came up, and they just looked at us, and they were curious. And hey, we said, hey, Thatch, go find out what they are. And we found out, oh, they really liked him. He was a good-looking guy. So from then on, whenever we saw German girls, the call would come down, we'd take that, we shaved him, we cut his hair, we put the best clothes on. We sent him out to the fence to talk to the German girls. You know why? The first girl had slipped him a potato, big potato, raw, true, but we cut it up, shared it. And by the way, you really learn how good men are. I mean, mankind. You women, don't get excited. Mankind is good, because when you're in that kind of a situation, you don't steal from each other, you don't lie to each other, and you share everything right down to the last bite. Anyway, we would send Thatcher out. Oh, but the rest of it looked terrible, but we made sure he looked good, and he'd go and talk to the girls, and he had some, I don't smoke, so I had cigarettes, I just gave them away, and he would give them cigarettes and talk to them and smile at them, and pretty soon they'd come back and they'd have maybe half a loaf of bread and 2 or 3 potatoes, and boy, that night we'd all split it up. Good old Thatch, you know. So anyway, they kept moving us. We moved up toward Denmark, and because we were not in a prison camp and because we were moving constantly, it was fairly easy to, it was easy to escape in comparison to being in a prison camp where you were constantly watched. So a couple of times I took off, but I was recaptured about, half a day later or something like that. One time I was recaptured by the Waffen-SS. Those are not nice people. They're not like the rest of the Germans. They weren't like the army. They were pretty mean, but the major, Luftwaffe major, found out where I was, and he came and he started arguing with the commander, who was a captain, a Hauptmann, in the Waffen-SS, and they were fighting over me, and I was sitting there watching. I said, well, I hope the Air Force wins. Sure enough, he did. And he took me again, and he said, now you can't keep escaping. You're giving me a lot of trouble. Anyway, actually he was a nice guy. But we marched on up to where Denmark was, and there we stayed for about, I guess it was about 4 or 5 days. And here came a truck, a Red Cross truck. Well, it had a Red Cross on it. And a fellow got out and he was talking to the guards. And it turned, the driver of that truck happened to be a Spaniard. He'd been captured during the war in Spain, and he'd been sent to Germany because, as you know, the loyalists were communists, or they were treated like communists. And so he wanted to know if anyone spoke Spanish. Well, I speak Spanish. I speak a couple of languages, but I speak Spanish. So I went up and I talked to him, and he told me he had all these packages and he couldn't deliver them because the lines had moved so far east that he couldn't get to the station he was supposed to. So would we like the Red Cross packages? Well, heck yes. So I got the guys over and we unloaded, and there was all kinds of stuff. There was big hunks of milk chocolate, which I glommed to right away, and I traded with the other guys. There was flour, there was all kinds of stuff. At any rate, he and I talked, and I told him, well, you know, my maternal grandmother was born in Seville, Spain, and he grew up in Madrid, and then he went to the United States. And my father's family, they came from the area of Barcelona. They were Catalans, or Catalunya. And they were here in 1602. They founded San Diego, as a matter of fact, and then went on, if you look it up in the history, they founded Albuquerque, New Mexico. They were founders in 1606, I believe. So that was before, about the time of Jamestown. So we were here a long time. But anyway, in my bad Spanish, I spoke with them, and we made good friends, and we got all the Red Cross packages. So then Major Tolliver and Vanderlinder and I got together. We said, you know, now's a good time. We could escape because now we've got food we can carry. We've got powdered milk, we've got chocolate, and we've got all the good things we can eat on the way, because the guys were already building ovens and baking and doing all kinds of things. So I couldn't do that, because we had a lot of the enlisted men who knew a lot more things than we knew. So we said, now, how can we do this? The major had left and left a captain in charge. And he was a real nice guy. So we said, tell you what, let's see if we can get his gun away from him. If we get his gun away from him, the others can't shoot us because we'll shoot him first. So they said, okay, we'll get on either side of the door, and as he comes through the door in that barn, we'll grab him, and one of us will get the gun. It so happened I was on the side where he had his gun, so I grabbed his gun. It turned out to be a Belgian gun, but it was a neat little gun. And we took him as our hostage. So we said, well, we need something to escape with. Do you have a truck? Do you have a car or something? He said, well, the Burgermeister has a car. Let's go see the Burgermeister. Oh, you sure? Yes, I'm sure. So we went to the Burgermeister's, and we got his car, and we put the captain in the right seat where he could be seen. Vanderlyn was all blonde and blue-eyed. He looked like he could be German. He was of Dutch descent. We put him up there as a driver, and Major Tollefson got on the left, and I got on the right, and I had the pistol right up against the back of the seat. And he knew that if he made one false move, that round was going to come through that seat into him. But he wanted us to capture them. He wanted to get away because the Russians were getting closer and closer. He didn't want to get captured by the Russians. Well, if I'd known he was going to be that easy, I wouldn't have even cocked the gun. But as we were driving through, there were German troops, they were sitting down or whatever, and they'd leap to their feet because they'd see the captain. They could see him sitting on the right side. They'd sit up and salute. And then they look, they probably wonder who that is, because the others don't look like Germans. They weren't in uniform. So we kept going, and we got to a British armored force. And there was a British lieutenant, and we told them who we were and so forth, and we had this captain, and they looked at Vanderlinder, and he had this little garrison cap, and he had skull and crossbones. They thought he was German. They were going to take him and shoot him because he was Waffen-SS, and they were going to shoot our captain. We said, no, he saved our lives. He's the reason we were able to escape. He's our prisoner. He's not your prisoner. And Major Tollefson was able to outrank the lieutenant that was in charge of the armored column. So we led them back to where the camp was, which was not very far away. Guess what? The guys were celebrating. The guards had said, the war's almost over. We don't want to be captured by the Russians, so they threw their guns down. They were all having a big time, toasting each other. If we'd known that, we'd have never tried to escape, but we didn't know it. So we got back in our little car. It was an Opel. I remember that so well. I remember that we'd go along these big trucks that were carrying tanks, the tank carriers, and the tires were higher than our roof. And that's where we got our gasoline, because they'd give us a jerry can and fill us up, and that thing didn't use much. We kept rolling. We got to the American lines, and we got to a German airfield captured by the Americans. So we're in good shape. Now, we hadn't had a real bath other than a sponge bath for a long time, and here they had beautiful quarters. Here's a German airfield. They really took care of their pilots. So we had a nice sitz bath and a shower, and they had a beautiful club, and the dining room had this big swastika on the wings of the Luftwaffe, and they had all these little buttons. All you had to do when you were in your room was push a button, and a fellow would come with water or whatever you wanted and shine your shoes, and all you had to do is keep pushing buttons. You got whatever you wanted. So boy, I should have joined the Luftwaffe.
Indeed, what a great story. Well, unfortunately, we used up all our time. We even exceeded it, so unfortunately, there won't be any time left for question and answers. But please join me again for a big hand for all.
I would like to make a comment.
Okay. Okay.
I'd like to make one comment. I enjoyed his presentation. I was a prisoner of the Germans. I wasn't where he was. I lost 50 pounds while I was a prisoner of the Krauts, okay? I worked as a laborer in the Munich rail yards and the Strasbourg rail yards. I got a bowl of soup, a cup of soup, half the size of this, and you wouldn't feed your dog the crap I got, okay? So everybody wasn't as swell as the people here. Thank you.
And I worked for that too.